So, welcome. So we do this Old Timers Night every 3 or 4 years or so. So it's been a few years since we've done it. We always have some good panelists and stuff. So I was going to make a couple of announcements first. A couple of us nominated the Mahoney Community Historical Museum for the best museum in our area through the Rutland Herald contest. So the voting doesn't start till Saturday, and it votes for about 2 weeks. I emailed the Rutland Herald this morning to find out how we vote, and nobody got back to me yet, but I suspect it'll probably be in the paper Saturday. They don't want people voting early. We're going to vote early and often, by the way, always. But they have the best in the area and a runner-up. So I figure if we all do get out there, there's a good chance we can be, you know, first or second and have our name mentioned. I mean, the only one that has the state's terrestrial fossil. You're welcome. Yeah, it's going to be on the news flash. You're right, it will be, because the voting doesn't start until Saturday. So, but I wanted to have the how to vote in the thing on the news flash, and right now, unless Steve figures it out, I don't have it. But so that was the first announcement. So on 2 weeks from Saturday, the 19th, we have a village tour. And if it's not really good weather, we'll do a collection tour. So we'll have a tour one way or the other. The ham dinner, the annual ham dinner is Labor Day weekend, September 2nd. Cider days, of course, we're on the greens Saturday and Sunday along with everybody else and stuff. And our annual Festival of Lights, our fundraiser in December, is the first Sunday in December, December 3rd. So I hope you get a chance to visit the museum. People that do see our museum that come from other areas around here understand that they're amazed at the size of the collection we've got for the size of the town we have. Because we have a really diversified, great collection of items for sure. And that's thanks to the board. That's thanks to the board for sure. So we have mammoth-related items. We were always selling the mammoth-related items plus the books and stuff. And there's breeding material. And you can always call and have a personal tour or of the village or the collection for sure. So I'm Dennis Devereaux, and I've been on the board for
the Hollenbach dinner.
The what?
The spaghetti dinner.
Oh, wait, there's another fundraiser. Yeah. Yes, that's right, for Beth Chase and her family and stuff, on the 26th, Saturday the 26th of August. So yes, you're right. Thank you. I didn't write it down, so I kind of forgot about it.
And we'll open early because the community association this Saturday. The Guild this Saturday.
The Guild Bazaar is this Saturday. Yeah.
So we'll open the museum early.
9 to 2.
9 to 2. And they have lots of things.
And the Community Association's garden tour is also Saturday.
They have a garden tour, and that might go from around 10 to 2 or 10 to 3.
No, it's
something like that.
awesome. We're going to go.
So,
We're all going.
So now we're going to get on to what we came for and stuff. So we have three panelists, and on your left is Kathy Heel. I keep saying Kathy Brown, but it's Kathy Heel. Stuff. So we got Kathy, we got Paul Nevin, and we've got Christine Pratt. And we're going to let them speak, 15, 20 minutes or something. I think it's appropriate if you want to ask a question or something. We might, if they go too quick, because they're shy or nervous or don't have enough to talk about, we'll probably go back around through them, because I'm sure I've got questions that I'd like to ask them myself. So we're going to get started with Kathy. You do have to hold it really close.
Okay. Welcome, and glad to see everybody here.
Hold it close.
And more loud. Really loud?
There you go.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, and it's nice to see everybody here. Hope you can get some different information tonight. Dennis asked me a while back if I would speak about the finish in Hortonville. At the time, he didn't know that I wasn't originally from there. came there later, but my mother was. So everything that I'm speaking about is what I remember, and it's pretty much off the cuff. I have a few dates, but not a lot of them. We came to Vermont to my grandparents that lived on Shunpike, and it was in December. My mother and father wanted to visit her parents, and at that time my father decided that maybe he would like to live in Vermont instead of where we were. He came from Connecticut, but we lived in Texas for 3 years because of his health. And when he came here and spent a week, he said, "This is where I want to be." So we lived with my aunt and uncle over in Shrewsbury, Frank and Jenny Lord. Jenny was my mother's oldest sister. And I went to school for a half a year at the Shrewsbury School. Mrs. Adams was the teacher at the time. And then my parents rented a little house in Cuttingsville. So I went to Cuttingsville for 1 year, and Mary Stapleton was our teacher. It was quite different for me coming because I came from a very large school, and I had never seen a one-room schoolhouse. So I had 3 different one-room schoolhouses before they built the new school down here. And then my parents were looking for a farm. They found one that Mrs. Oyella and her husband's family owned. It was the Johnson Farm. And that's where we ended up living for many years. And through the years, down below us, there was very few people around, but there was an abandoned house that the Allen family lived in for a number of years. And then right next to us, the closest house was Mr. and Mrs. Davidson. And they were Finnish. They had a daughter, Lillian. And going out on the Russellville Road, it went to Shrewsbury, but it was still considered part of it, Mount Holly. And actually, my aunt and uncle's barn was in Mount Holly, their house was in Shrewsbury. But there was a Finnish family called Mr. and Mrs. Hessela, and they were known as the chicken farmers. They had a lot of chickens. Very nice people, very quaint, and they kind of kept to themselves. They were happy to have my mother close by because she could speak English and to them, but she could also speak Finnish, and they preferred that she speak Finnish to them. She was also able to write it. And then with coming up the road, there was another gentleman, Mr. Alto, and he was only there a short time. When he passed, then Mr. Kelly, Senior, Lawrence Kelly, he was a plumber. He bought the house. Going down the road from the Davidsons, there was Elsie Holmes, and she was part of the Oyella family. Probably you know the name as Ojala, but it was always pronounced Oyella when I was growing up. And she had a son that was close to my age, and that was Ernie. She also had an older son, Ronald, and then she had one other son, William, Billy. And then it was the Grange Hall. The old school, the one-room schoolhouse, was already closed at that point. A couple of my mother's family, her youngest sister and her younger brother both went there. And then she had another sister, at the time Gladys Gage, which probably a lot of you remember. She was a teacher, and since one of my mother's sisters really wanted to learn the piano, but the finances were tight, so what she did is she exchanged piano lessons, and my mother's sister was able to teach the children that couldn't speak English, taught them. After that was Mr. and Mrs. Oyela's house, and they had a few children, Carl, I can't remember all the others, but anyway, and they were older than I was. The next place was where Mary Nortonen, and it was Walt Nortonen and his wife, and Mary and her husband lived upstairs when I was growing up. Down on the corner was a Finnish gentleman, Mr. Zeppi, and then there were the Frenches. Norris Barrett and his wife, they weren't Finnish, but they had the farm just below there, and across the street was Mrs. Huskisson. And from what I understand, several years prior, Mrs. Huskisson's daughter died of a very contagious disease, and she was left by herself. Beyond that, the next place was my grandparents, Henry and Catherine Braudillo. And they had several children. My Aunt Jenny was the oldest, and then my mother, she had a brother, she had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. But my mother and one of her brothers ended up leaving early on. The others stayed and ran the farm. One of the sons was into logging, cutting wood, etc. So they logged off the part of the farm. They ended up buying more land from Mr. Barrett, and they bought land up on French Hill. They stayed there, and my grandfather passed away in 1950. So it left my Aunt Nelma, my Uncle Ed, to run the farm, and until my Aunt Nelma passed away, they ran it. And then my mother's other sister and her husband, he had retired from General Electric, so they purchased the farm, and they didn't use it as a farm, they just kept it. Up above there was the Lundgrens, and at one point there was a young Finnish family that came from Finland, and they only stayed a short time. They had 2 young children. The children didn't go to school here, but and then it just goes on up through the 3 Syria brothers, and we went to school with Sylvia. One of them was Eleanor, and she was a little bit older than we were, and then her brother was younger, so we did not go to school with him. There was J.Lo Rivers, the Leightonens, one other one. But anyway, they lived there, and each one of them had a different trade. About the only ones that were left, there was Esther Hano and her mother, and they had a nice barn, but they did not farm. They let Ralph Cook and he farmed it for a number of years. And Miss Esther's mother passed away, and she stayed there for many years, and then finally sold it. And I went to the one-room school that Charlene and Warren Cole lived in. And we went there a couple of years. There was the Cole family. Quite a few. And I still had an accent, so I used to get picked on with a few of the older boys, but Johnny Cole always came to my rescue. And he was one of these people that he didn't say much, but when he did, it meant a lot. My Aunt Nelma used to, instead of going to church every week, she used to go to a lot of the Finnish shut-ins. And Mrs. Enola, who was related to the Coles, she used to go there and just do her rendition, played music. At the time, Oral Roberts was very popular, and she had quite a few of his records. And they would sing, or just, it was their version of going to church. There were several other, in Healville, there were several other Finnish families, and at various times she would go there also. In school, it was very different because it still was a one-room schoolhouse, but the first day that I went, they said, the school bus is going to pick you up down at Mr. Barrett's. And that was 1 mile from the house. And it was, in those days, they didn't have door-to-door service. And the school bus, I was looking for a bigger vehicle, but it was Kyle Perry's father's station wagon. And the only ones on it at the time were Edie Sampson, and she lived up toward where Kyle Perry lives. She wasn't a Finnish family, but you know, she blended right in with all the Finnish children. And Ernie Holmes and myself. And then as we went further, I don't know if he picked others up or not, but a lot of, I know the Cole family used to, and the Hart family used to walk to school. Later on, and Christine was saying it's, I'm not sure on the date, but she said 1957 when we started the new school. And there again, it was still, Mr. Perry wasn't the bus driver, his son was Kyle. So we went through the 8th grade down at the new school. One of the things with the Finnish family and my grandparents, as soon as you walked in the door, you smell the coffee. They always had a coffee pot on the wood stove. Most of them had wood stoves. They did a lot of their baking in wood stoves, which was very interesting. And there was always a pot of oatmeal. I can remember my grandmother going through the door, she'd hand me a little bowl of oatmeal. And my mother said, now, don't say anything, just eat it. So that's the way it was. And most of the Finnish families, they all greeted you with a smile, and then they offered you coffee and coffee bread, pastries. They had all kinds. There's a Finnish coffee bread. I have not had good luck making it. I know Stephanie does, and one of my cousins, she makes it quite often. Anytime she's coming to Vermont, she always makes it and brings it to us. But I'm sure Stephanie knows far more of the recipes. And there were not, when we were here, there were not that many Finnish farms left that were working. The Cole family, one of the Syria families, and I think that was all that I remember at the time. There was other farms, but the Finnish farms were. I understand when I was reading Carol Tarbell's first edition of his book that he published, that Harry Hill actually did some farming, and I believe he was Finnish. From what I read anyway, he was Finnish. So, but all the rest of the farms were run by, you know, there were some Polish people in town. The Finns from the Mount Holly area, my grandparents came from Finland to Michigan, and then my grandfather worked in the coal mines. Quite a few of them did work in the mines. They migrated across to South Hill and Ludlow, and that's where my grandparents started, but then they came to Mount Holly. Quite a few of the Finns also, they would get together in a certain area. South Hill has still quite a few of the Finnish families. Mount Holly has a few, but not to the degree that it was, you know, many years ago. So, and that's my recollection of childhood.
Would you guys like to take a little break in between the speakers? There's food up there. I'm speaking for myself.
Hi, I'm going to talk a little bit about Lake Nineveh. My family first came to Vermont this summer in 1947. And they didn't go to Lake Nineveh the first 2 years, they went to Lowell Lake. So the first year they went to Lowell Lake, they were a little disappointed in the cabins. They were a little rustic, and so they spoke to the owner, and he said he'd have that fixed for the following year. So they showed up the next year, and nothing was changed. So there were advertisements in the New York Times for Lake Nineveh, and they decided they'd try Lake Nineveh out. Now, they showed, that was the summer of 1949, and we always came in August, so for the month of August. And I was always amazed because all the cabins that Vin Blakely, the man who owned the west side of the lake, rented were extremely rustic. So I can't imagine what those old cabins were like. But I really think that, I know other people showed up and were disappointed, but the lake was so beautiful, I think they just put all that aside. But just to show you how rustic the cabins were, the one that we rented was called Happy Days. And the bathrooms in all these places were sort of add-ons. There was the flush toilet, that was the bathroom, nothing else in the room. And some of them were on front porches. In Happy Days, it was sort of added on one of the bedrooms. And the family joke was it was not put together all that nicely You could sit on the john and pick raspberries because they grew through the wall. And every other one of the, nobody had a complete bathroom of the cabins that he rented until 1954 when he started building new cabins, but they were extremely rustic places. Now, Vin Blakely was the owner from, I believe the first year he came was 1946, and he was there until 1970. And he bought the piece of land. It was about 360 acres, at least that's what he told me at the time. And that was the whole west side of Lake Nineveh.
Wow.
And he paid $10,000 for it. And it took a little while for him to get all these cabins so they could be rented at all. But this man was amazing. I know there's at least a few people in the audience that remember him. He came back up, and he came from the Canisteo area of New York, Hornell, and he worked in the store, in a grocery store, and he was up for a promotion. He didn't get the promotion, and he was really annoyed, so he quit. He went across the street and bought a building and opened up his own grocery store and ran the other guy out of business. So it tells you a little bit about his character. But anyway, he was like the Pied Piper for all of us when we were kids. We followed him around. Eventually, I was there for the whole summer because my family bought the little falling down cabin in 1956. But all the different things that Vin did, we just followed him around and learned things. And his stream of money, the things that he did to earn money, they had a store there. He sold bait. He rented boats. He sold vegetables. Of course, he rented the cabins. He just had so many different things that, to keep him going. So, but the most unusual thing that attracted us when we were growing up was the garbage run. Very often, twice a week, he would go around. He had this Farmall Cub tractor, an old beat-up trailer, and he would go around the lake pulling this trailer, and all the kids that were there for the summer would pile on the trailer, and we'd be the runners. And when we come to the cabin, you'd jump off, you'd go grab the garbage. And so it's a crazy thing, but we all enjoyed it. It was like one of the highlights of the week, the garbage run. So now, on one of these, and all the garbage went in a cellar hole down the road that he had permission. Of course, when we got there, we were taking the bottles and smashing against the walls of the cellar hole, and that was sort of a highlight too. On this one garbage run, there was one of the renters was sitting in the trailer, and Vin was backing up to get close, and somehow he got pulled out of that trailer, and the trailer ran over him. And really didn't do any damage, except he had a perfect tire track on his arm. He became quite famous for this. He'd get run over by a trailer and get up, and he's actually sitting in the room. I see him. Anyway, now all the things that they offered, Vin and Mary Blakely, in addition to the garbage run, they offered all these programs. So it was almost like going to camp. They gave swimming lessons. They gave painting lessons. We had 2 suppers a week. They hikes. We went on the long trail. We went on hikes around Lake Nineveh. They took us to Hortonville square dances, which were something in themselves. I mean, I know many of you, or it was a little crazy. It got even crazier after 11 o'clock intermission, because everybody got to the cars and have a few drinks and then they come back in. So from 11 to 12, it even got more wild. But back up here a little bit. Each one of these cabins that he rented had a name. That was the way he identified it. Like the one that we rented was Happy Days. Then there were three at what we call Blakely Meadow. There was Holiday, Beachcomber, and Lazy Days. And then further away, there was Lakeside or Blueberry Patch, all things that sort of told where they were, Meadowlark. And there was another one added, and it ties into a little bit of what you said. Bluebird was owned originally by Ralph Cook, and he ended up selling that to Vin Blakely, so that added, one more cottage that he could rent. Then in 1954, he started building a cabin a year. Now these new cabins had full bathrooms, showers and sinks and all. They were much a big improvement to the old cabin. So he built one in 54 that was Mountain View, and then he built Hearthside, then he built Sunny Days, and then he built Lakeview. So those were, much improved to the original cabins that were there. Now, today, there are none of the old cabins left. There's part of one, Blueberry Patch, they rebuilt, they left just a little bit of the original cabin. All the original cabins are gone. Mountain View, the first cabin he built, was torn down. Hearthside was torn down and another house was built there. But Sunny Days and Lakeview are two of the remaining cabins from the Vin Blakely era. Now, I'll go back, sort of started with this, but Lake Nineveh's had at least half a dozen names. The earliest name I could find of it, it was Patchness Pond. And it was much smaller at that time. I saw that on a map from 1752, and that's before they dammed the lake. And then it was called Beals Pond, it was called Patch Pond, it was called Sick Reservoir, Spathic Iron Corporation. Sucker Pond was a nickname it had. And we're trying to figure out exactly how it came to be called Nineveh. Nineveh is a biblical name, and originally the name was E.H. And somewhere along the way they changed it to A.H. And Zoa Town and Fletcher wrote a little booklet, and she was said in her booklet that she was upset that they changed the spelling of Lake Nineveh. So, and I don't know exactly when they dammed the lake, but they doubled the size of the lake. That was the whole west side of the lake used to be pasture, and if you paddle around in the lake, you can see stone walls. There are a number of stone walls buried in the water, if you know where to look for them. And it's almost like they had a plan where they wanted the edge of the lake to be. There's a lot of stone wall around portions of the lake. So the lake was used for power in Tyson Furnace, so they'd send somebody up from Tyson to open up the dam to get water down there, and then walk up at the end of the day and close the dam. So it provided power. So let me see what else I'm forgetting here. I guess that's, I'll wait if there are any questions later, but yeah.
What about the notice? When we were 12, 14 years old, we heard about the notice, we were always going to go over and try to find it.
Yeah, the nudist camp, yeah. I was interested in that too. I'll tell this little aside. Before I worked for Vin Blakely, and one of the things he did, another thing he did, that he got horses from Mr. Lord, and he brought them up. There would always be 4 or 5 horses to rent. So it was my job, since I worked for Vin Blakely in the summers, to catch the horses and saddle them and get them ready for people to ride. But I got to ride free, so one day I decided I was going to ride over to the other side of the lake and go over to the dam, and I rode up on the dam, and here were about 10 young ladies from the Farmer Wilderness camps down below, and none of them had any clothing on. So that was my introduction to the nudist camp. But the camps were Quaker camps, and very often they swam suitless. It wasn't really a nudist camp, it was swimming in the nude. You do that at the YMCA, but anyway, at least in the men's YMCA you do. It wasn't really a nudist camp, it was suitless swimming. And that still goes on today to some extent on the dam in Lake Nineveh. There are people that swim suitless, but it was never a nudist camp. But I would say the majority of the people around the lake are not running around nude then. So. I know that for but that's but now you bring that up, I don't know how many times you mentioned, oh, you live in Lake Nineveh. That's the first thing that people say. Oh, you live up in the nudist camp. Anyway. Thank you for introducing that. I guess that's, unless there are any questions later, I'll pass the mic over to Christine. Thank you.
I was lucky enough to be born here and raised on a farm. I went to Belmont one-room school, and the one-room school was across from where Lynn Herbst lives. I don't know if any of you remember, Dennis would remember it, but that's where I started school, and it was very rustic, to say the least. There were 8 grades, and we had kind of an indoor bathroom. That's what we used, and we had a wood furnace that was our heat in the winter. And I don't know where the wood came from that heated it in the winter, but the wood was always there, and the older boys would help out putting the wood in the furnace. We all had to take turns as we got older to walk down to the store and bring water back for us to drink. So that's where we got our water supply, was at the Belmont store. So it was, to say the least, a little bit chilly when we would get there in the morning. And my first teacher was Mrs. Lord, who lived over on the Hortonville side, and it was her husband that supplied the horses for Lake Nineveh. So she was a really good teacher. I don't know how she managed teaching 8 grades, but we all got an education that we all learned from the older kids. When they were having their classes, we were listening to them. But we didn't miss out on any classes or anything. We had art. We would have that on Friday afternoons. We would draw. We would make all of our decorations for Christmas, Easter, all of the holidays. And we would put different pictures that we drew in the windows. So if any parents came, they got to see it. But we also had to go, when we had town meeting day, it used to be over here in what is now the library. And there was all pews in there, so we were all required to go to town meeting and sit there and listen. We were in the back rows. So then we would spend the day listening to everything that took place at town meeting. And then at lunchtime, we would go up to the church, and the ladies at the church would have a meal for everybody at town meeting, and the girls would have to serve the food. And once Dennis got a little older, he served punch.
No, they didn't like to touch coffee, but I was a little adult, okay?
Bring them in for the coffee.
But that's how we got to see how some of the government worked in the town, was going to town meeting. And then we would go the next day and discuss it at school, what was said at the town meeting. Some of the meeting got to be a little lively at times, some of the discussions, but it always got resolved right there. So back then, I had no bus, so my father would bring me to school in the morning, and I would walk home from Belmont home. And I was always told never to ride with anybody, to walk. So one time, Alan Deverell saw me walking, and he was good friends with my father, but he asked me if I wanted to ride, and I said, no, I can't ride with you. So he immediately told my father that I refused to ride. So we did that the whole 4 years that I was up there. My mother didn't have a license. She didn't get her license until she was in her 40s, and she and Jacomina Balestra and B. Busno all went together to take driving lessons. So they didn't have the licenses back then like they have now, but I walked. The only day that it was really kind of hard walking was we had a fire in the furnace at school, so they let us out early. And it was snowing and it was really bad, but we had to walk home. So anyway, in 1957, we went down to the existing school down here, and that's where I met Kathy. We were in 5th grade. So we've stayed friends ever since 5th grade. But back then, the teachers still had, at that time, 1st and 2nd grade was in one room, 3rd, 4th, and 5th was in one room, and 6th, 7th, and 8th. But the teachers still had to teach all of the same subjects. But that was pretty much expected, and we had some really good teachers back then. Mrs. Lord was still there. She was teaching 1st and 2nd grade. And Mr. Stock was 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And Miss Spalding was the upper grades. But we stayed that way until Kathy and I graduated from 8th grade. And there were 12 of us that graduated. And we all graduated always up at the library, up on the stage up there, and that's where we had our little graduation party. But back then, we always had picnics for all of the school kids, and we used to go like to Hackwood Pond and the bus. They had a bus at that point that took us over there for the picnics. But I still didn't have a bus to get back and forth. I walked. So by the time I was in 5th grade, my sister was in 1st grade with Dennis. That was their first year in the school. So we walked home, and I walked home with Donnie and Etta Gates. So that was, we never had a bus that took us anywhere, but it wasn't bad walking home. So after we had graduation from 8th grade, at that point we had a choice of school. You could go to Ludlow, Wallingford, or Rutland. and I chose to go to Rutland, and I went from 12 kids to 210 in my class. So that was kind of a reverse culture shock of what you came from when you came here. So at that point, we had gym and everything else. We never had gym when we were in grade school. We played softball and kickball and up and down the snowbanks and everything else, but I managed to, in school, be on the varsity softball and basketball, and we had field hockey, so I think I managed okay without having phys ed down here. But it was just a total different thing being in school back then. I never saw any of the bullying that kids experience now that they have to deal with. We kind of all got along because we were all either from a family of farmers or just general carpenters or whatever. So we were all in the same boat. But things were definitely very different. And growing up, my grandmother had the telephone. She was a telephone operator for the whole town, and it was in her house. So you had a party line, and sometimes you had 8 or 9 people on that party line, and it wasn't always easy to make a call. And a lot of times, the way the calls went through, you know, whether it was a short or a long ring, you would hear it in your house for somebody else up the road from you. So you always had to deal with whether you could get on the line or not. But my grandmother did that for years, and then at one point, my Aunt Hilda lived in Brattleboro. She got sick, so my grandmother had to go down and help her out, and my mother had to run the telephone. My mother wasn't from around here. She was from Australia, and my father met her in the service, and it took like, I guess, a couple years before she could even come back here after he got out of the service. And at the same time, she was friends with B. Busno, who was married to Ephraim, and she was from New Zealand. So they kind of formed a friendship, and that's how they ended up going to driving class together. So that got them out of the house for a little while. But when we were down at the new school in 1957, my mother was the janitor for 21 years down there.
God bless.
So in the summertime after we finished haying, I had to go down and help my mother do a total cleaning job of the school from top to bottom. And Kathy's father was on the school board at the same time that my mother was working down at the school. So they kind of formed a friendship too from that experience. So that was different, having to, you sure didn't misbehave when you were in school, because if your mother was down there every night, she was going to hear about it. So that wasn't going to happen. My father and Alan Devereaux and Garfield Potter, they were one of the few first ones that started our first fire department here in town. And that was certainly not a very big department. And, you know, if there was a fire at nighttime, and most of the fires that they had were really bad ones that were at farms, and they didn't have the equipment to save very much. But they tried and they got it started, and it's certainly nothing like what the fire department is today that we have. And then my father and Tino Balestra and Kyle Perry were on the select board for years and years, and the town was not as large as, I mean, the town itself was, but there weren't as many people, and they certainly didn't have to deal with a lot of the issues that are there now. I think the worst thing my father and Tino had to deal with was a gentleman over on the Hortonville side. He was in a tin building and it got struck by lightning and he got killed. And my father and Tino had to go at that scene and get the gentleman out of it. And then at one point there were some starving animals down in the East Wallingford area, and so my father and Tino had to find a place to bring these animals where they could be rescued. So they brought them there, and that took quite a lot of work, just getting the animals there to have them saved. But also my father and Alan and Ephraim Busno were in the Oddfellows here for over 55 years, and many of the recipes that are being used today for our suppers are what Alan put together, and he was very instrumental in getting all of these suppers together. And I guess Dennis is following in his footsteps. So it was a whole different lifestyle back then of how we did things, and people were always there to help people and never questioned if somebody needed help. I always remember my parents going and helping, and everyone else in the community would help out. And it just seems like it's changed a lot the way people feel about people. But for fun in the summer times, Alan Deverell's family and the Pelsos that lived down here in the yellow house where Peggy Gleason lives, and we would all have big family summer picnics, and we would rotate, go to the Deverell's place, Pelsos, down to our house. So us kids all kind of hung out together and had a good time at these picnics. And we also had large family picnics with the Flanders, because I'm related to all the Flanders. And then on my grandfather's side, all of the Pratts and the Carrolls and Rutland would all come down to my grandparents' house. There'd be over 100 of us having family picnics in the summer. But the most fun that I think I had was riding my horse. And I've had my first horse I got from Mrs. Lord, and you could always have a horse in the wintertime after they came back from the camp. So I would get a horse from her and have it on our farm, and we would bring it back up to Lake Nineveh in June. And
I remember all the names too.
remember Tony?
Oh, sure.
That
Tony the Pony.
That was mine. And so then I got my own horse when I was 9 years old and rode that horse forever. And I had fun riding with Kathy and Martha Balestra. That was our time-out time. And the only time out we had was when we could get away and ride the horse. And we did that a lot. And I also rode with Emily once in a while when she would be up here in the summer, and she had her horse and she'd come over on the Belmont side and ride. So we had that fun. And then we also had square dances here that the Oddfellows put on, and
They were the best.
that was kind of like your Hortonville ones.
Well, I came to these dances here as well.
They get a little rowdy and later on in the evening too. But that was some of the fun things that we were able to do when we weren't doing our chores. So that was kind of what I grew up with here in town.
I need I left one important thing out at an event in Lake Nineveh. I met my wife there when we were 12 years old. We did wait a few years to get married. Sorry, dear, I've left that out. Questions? I don't know.
You guys, whether that's some questions or, I know a big thing that happened in the early 60s, and I talked to Christine on the phone about it the other day. There were a lot of small farms all over town. Some had 10 cows, maybe 15 or 20. In about 1962, 63, the U.S. Department of Agriculture said every small town, farm has to put in a bulk tank. These farmers made about $3,000 a year, and putting in a bulk tank, a building with a cold water tub to keep their milk really cold, to keep it fresh for a few days, they had to spend $5,000 or $6,000 to do it, and most of them shut down. They weren't going to do it. And it affected them. I know it affected Kathy's father and Christine's father. Everything changed. A lot of those guys went to work. A lot of them went into GE. I know a lot of them.
Yeah. The other stipulation also that went with that is in the beginning when they first announced it, that in our case, I had a horse. I used to get it from Mr. Lord. Had to take it back in the summer. But our barn was designed so there were 2 box stalls, and one was a calving box stall. The other one was just for the calves as they were growing up. They didn't segregate them, you know, individually. So my horse was in one of those, and when milk inspectors came around, they told us that once the bulk tanks went in, you could not have a horse in the same milking stable. So that was another thing, but that was a big thing for my parents, why they got rid of the cows. And fortunately, my father was a painter, wallpaper, decorator, so he had that to continue with. And there's a couple of things that once Christine was talking, and Dennis mentioned this, that probably it would jiggle my mind. But Mr. Davidson, the farm near us, he had just a few cows, but everything that he did was with a team of horses. And he also had it was called a wooden leg at the time, but he had a prosthesis. And it was difficult for him to get on and off from the machinery. But this one day my dad was coming home and he saw Mr. Davidson flying through the field, and he had taken the cutter bar and run into a bee's nest. And of course the bees were after the horses and him, and he stuck with it and he got to the barn. He was a little bit shook up, but that was how he did. He had nothing, no tractors. Everything was done with the horses. And the other thing that came to mind is I had a mile to walk to catch the school bus. So that was okay. But then when the weather became nice, I asked Mr. Barrett one day if I could ride my horse down. And he had a little, off from his house, is where he housed his horses earlier years. And he said, one condition, the first time you don't clean that after that horse, you can't bring it again. So that was a big thing. You had to make sure the stall was clean and take the manure away. So that was a nice thing to be able to ride the horse down rather than to walk down. You have to,
No, on that, she's still cleaning the barn.
Yeah, but you're doing the mess.
I don't know if anybody had any questions or anything. It looks like a few questions. You guys okay?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not lightheaded or anything.
I got a quick question. You said you came from Connecticut. Where in Connecticut did your family come from?
my father came from Old Lyme.
That's where I live. That's interesting. I'll talk after.
Go ahead, Bill.
Just extending the where you came from theme, you mentioned that there were a number of Finnish families in the area. Did they all sort of come the way your family did, just sort of by chance? Or was there something unusual that led people from Finland to come to, shall we say, a rather remote area like this?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that quite a few of the Finnish were right on the Russian border, and there was turmoil going on, and they knew people here that had come prior to their coming. That's what I was given to understand. And the other thing is the area was open so that they could farm, and they could farm easier here than over there.
Peter, go ahead, sure.
Well, just a couple of comments to add to what you've been saying. One of the people who, I guess, married into the White family here in town was Sherman Adams. And he, among other things, eventually, I think, became governor of New Hampshire and on into politics. But he was not a popular fellow here in town because, and this may have accounted for at least some of the Finnish people, he would go down to Boston and meet the ships coming in from Europe and offer the people jobs up here in Mount Holly. And he'd put them on the train. And of course, when they got off the train in Mount Holly, the amount of pay he was offering was dramatically different. But they were stuck here. Now, that obviously wasn't true of all of them, but it was one of the things that made him very unpopular in town.
He was a young forester right out of college when he came to this area, and I know there's others that know too, but they were logging off our side of Okemo.
Yeah.
My grandfather had gone through World War I and recovered from some injuries. And then about the time my father was born in the early 20s, a whole bunch of local guys, including my grandfather, worked for Sherman Adams, logging off Okemo. They were cutting logs. The government in the state had allowed this and stuff. And he married Rachel White, one of the, and he did become chief of staff for Eisenhower in the 50s. And there was a little scandal. There was a little, was it a dog or something? Or there was something. Anyway, he resigned and he became governor of New Hampshire. And their family, they visited often. And their girls and their son are about my age. And they stayed up here. They had a little cabin on about an acre of land up behind Ronnie Unnerman's, up in the woods. I'm sure the cabin is probably fallen in and over.
No, it hasn't.
Oh, it hasn't fallen in.
I'll tell you a story about that. I want to go back to something Christine said, but as far as the cabin is concerned, I don't know that Rachel Adams, Sherman's wife, was a lot more popular than he was. But I was working for Bud Flanders, Clyde Flanders Jr. one summer, And we had just, I'd forgotten what we were doing. We just finished raking some hay, and we were back to have lunch, and we were sitting there just outside the house, and this car drove in with New Hampshire license plates. I don't remember what they were, 3 digits or something like that. And this woman got out and walked up to Bug, and she said, "I don't know if you know who I am." He said, "Oh yeah, I know who you are." And I don't remember just where that conversation went, but Bug's mother and father had built the small cabin right at the crest of the hill on the south side of the road there. It's been added to quite a bit since then. And they spent the winter in Ludlow. And my father, Rachel wanted to find out about buying the top of that hillside there. And so that's why she stopped. And Bug said, "Well, you've got to go talk to my mother and father. They're up there at the cabin." So she went up there and stopped. And according to Roxy, who related this to my dad the next day, said, "You know, we want to buy this 40-acre piece up here." She said, "How much do you want for it?" Well, Roxy didn't particularly know. She just picked a figure out of the air. She said, "Well, $50 an acre." And Rachel said, "Oh my gosh, that's way too high. I wouldn't think of paying that much money." I remember when land sold for $1 an acre here in town. And Roxy said, "Yeah, and I remember when a man worked for $1 a day, too." But those days are history. And so Rachel said, "Well, I'll have to think about it." And Roxy, being Roxy, and a little discusses, "Well, you better think about it real fast because there are a lot of people that are interested." Well, later that day, my dad hadn't seen them since they had come back up from Ludlow. We saw Roxy outside, so we stopped to say hello. And Roxy related this story to him. Well, my dad knew that I liked that hillside, so he said, "We'll buy it." Rachel came back the next day and said, "Well, I made up my mind, we'll pay that." Roxy said, "Sorry, sold." But I wanted to go back. You were talking about just quick, the development of the fire department here in town. Shortly after my dad and mother bought the house we live in, he was out one evening doing something, and he could see a fire down below, which he thought was a tree on fire. So he grabbed a pail and headed down through, only to discover that it was the barn at what was then the Tarble Farm, now the Blue Farm. And at that time, the barn was out next to the road, sort of across the little driveway next to the house. The fire department then was a bucket brigade from the brook up across, and there was no attempt to save the barn. That was history. But my dad told about how they threw water on the side of the house to keep it from burning, and the water would immediately vaporize as the side of the house was so hot. Now that was a predecessor to our fire department.
So, anything else?
I have just a reference to
Sure.
what he said about, quite a few of the Finnish came into Massachusetts, and they were offered jobs in the woolen mills here. So there were quite a few of the Finnish and the Polish that worked in all of the woolen mills. My mother and her family being one of them. The other thing is, Mr. Davidson that had the horses, the only way he got his milk to the Crowley Cheese Factory was with his horses. And in the earlier days, they had a station down by the store, and the train came in, and a lot of the milk was, because my mother had a horse and sleigh, and they brought all of their milk down there. And there was a couple of others that did the same thing, and they used to take the horses in the wintertime and come up here to the lake and cut blocks of ice to put in their, they had a regular ice shed.
Ice box, right?
Yeah, and they had big blocks of ice. And a lot of the Finnish families had, now my grandparents' house had one, I know the Davidsons did, and I think the Oyella Farm, I'm not sure about any of the others. Probably the Hesselas did also, but that's the way they kept things cold.
Well, we appreciate your coming. We certainly appreciate our panel for talking to us. About 2:30 in the afternoon, this afternoon, I tried to doze off. I was trying to read, and the phone rang. And Kathy called to talk a little bit about tonight and stuff. And she said, well, how many people do you think will be there? And I should have said maybe 10 or 15. Instead I said, oh, probably 50, 60, 70. And she said, oh my. So I wasn't sure if she was going to show up. But I think they all did a great job.